Hello and welcome to Wild Sounds the Film Podcast. I'm Kierston Drier here with my co-host Matthew Toffolo, and today we're going to keep going with our mini-series on 10 films that changed the world. So Matt, what you got on this one today?
We're going to be talking about a movie that's from my generation called Pulp Fiction, and I'll just throw it out there that we can discuss each point step by step, but there's three reasons why this movie changed cinema. Reason number one is from the storytelling standpoint, the dialogue and violence that is used in this movie. So like the dialogue they used, they made low lives cool. So they are talking about nothing, kind of a Seinfeld era that we're in right now, and they're bad people entering bad situations, but we like them because of what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is a huge thing that's going to be happening and still happening today. In the violence, of course, because I call it like they pay attention to the seams. Like it's like they really show the violence. Like and they even stay with the violence after the violence occurs. Where before this movies would just like kind of like see someone shoot somebody, but they would never actually see the gunshot and go into the person's like skull and like blood spurting out. Like he was into that kind of like let's show this. And so that's point number one from the way they made the film. Point number two is it's the Generation X, the VCR generation of filmmakers, where young men, including myself, were able to watch movies multiple times for the first time in this generation, because before that you'd have to go to the movies to watch things. So we're able to watch Star Wars or Raiders of the Lost Ark like 15, 20 times. So we absorbed film knowledge without actually working in industry and going to school. So this sort of type of filmmaking set up this huge renaissance of 90s filmmakers, including Steven Soderbergh, P.T. Anderson, David O. Russell, Kevin Smith, Gus Van Sant, Coen Brothers. So that's sort of like it's that poster child of that generation. And the third point is like a business aspect where Miramax was the producer of this film, so it became their huge hit. So they were already distributing films and basically grabbing festival darlings before this, but this was their first monster hit. So the movie cost $8 million to make. They made over $200 million at the box office. So they made so much money, so they were able to invest their business into other distributions. So at the same time, what happened was that before this, like movies were always made within the studio system. So all of a sudden, within the new technology, with people having video cameras, like there was and of course the birth of film festivals in a mainstream way, we were able to have independent films. So this was like the poster child of like the independent low budget films, which spawned the other studios to have subdivisions, and like Sony and Paramount to have their own subdivisions and make like small films and pick up distribution deals. So the movie cost $8 million to make. Like I said, $5 million went to the actors' salaries. Oh. And $3 million went to the making of the movie. And so those are the three kind of reasons why this movie changed cinema. And of course, personally, I have a soft spot to it, but we'll get to it in a second. So what about you? Like you're 4 years old when this movie came out, or 3 years old when this movie came out?
Yeah, so I was 3 years old when this movie came out. So obviously I didn't see it for a while. And when I watched it for the first time, I think I was in college, and my friends were like, "You haven't seen Pulp Fiction? Oh my God!" And I was like, "All right." Now it was built up a lot in my mind. They were like, "You're gonna see Pulp Fiction. This is gonna change your life." And I was like, "Oh, okay, all right, let's get the popcorn. Like, impress me." And I watched it, and I was so confused, because I was like, it feels like we're just watching like 5 acts, and each act is just like one person's kind of story, and there's a lot of violence in it. What's in the suitcase? And yeah. I was frustrated, and my friends were like, "You didn't get it. You don't get it." I'm like, "I clearly don't. Explain." But I will have to say, you made a couple really interesting points that kind of illuminated things for me. I had no idea that the film, like, I heard it was an air quotes low budget film, but I was like, it didn't really resonate to me like what that meant. I saw these massive faces. I saw, so many famous people in there. I was like, there was no like, oh, but they weren't quite as famous. I'm like,
they weren't, at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, I bet they were a little bit famous, but I had no idea, and now it makes total sense. You mentioned that the budget was $8 million and $5 went to the actors. So yeah. Actual production was $3 million. That changes the whole game. Now I understand a lot more.
I was talking to jump on your point. I was talking to a friend of mine. He's a big music guy, and he was talking about, like, we were talking about eras of music, and he was saying about how he would watch he would listen to Guns N' Roses in order to run or perfect example is Soundgarden at first when he was a kid, but then to get to the birth of Soundgarden, you have to hit Nirvana. So it's almost like up for you. So the whole analogy meaning for you is that by the time you watch the film, the whole kind of vacuum of how Pulp Fiction changed cinema, you've already seen different variations of this type of movie before, this different variations of this type of dialogue before. But when the movie first came out in 1994, we never saw two gangsters having a conversation about Amsterdam kind of a thing, But by the time you watch the film, you've already seen variations of this type of film. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, no, totally. Because, you're right. By the time I had seen it in college, we're talking close to 20 years later, the movie had already had its cultural, it has already produced its cultural wave of, I don't want to say copycats, but people who are paying homage to it. And there's, the generation of people who were young and impressionable watching Pulp Fiction went on in the next 20 years to make their own cinema with nods to Pulp Fiction. So it's an incredibly, and you made another interesting point about the indie darling, which is a couple other pieces we're going to bring up in this series of 10 films that are, stolen from the indie darling community and then thrust into commercially massive media light, right? Pulp Fiction's totally one of those. And looking back at it now, I can see all the things that Pulp Fiction does that were the origin source of the echo for the rest of media to come after.
So when I first watched this movie, I was in my last year of high school, and what happened was that this movie started this revolution of kids going to film school. And so back in my generation, what you would do, especially the 80s kind of cultural kind of situation where you would kind of go to university to be a lawyer, doctor, you some sort of trade, right? Some sort of financial kind of the diploma or graduate degree that you would make some money when you got out. And this was this huge rush of because of the music that was going on, because of the times that we're in, is people started going to film school. And this was so when I entered film school the next year, there are so many Tarantinoites out there. They're as you said, that everybody was making their versions from this generation. And it was just such an interesting kind of movie because it was all of a sudden it was become for me, I never really got to know, I would buy the soundtrack of this movie. I wanted to know, like you said, what's in the briefcase. I would want to pick this movie apart and kind of like how comic book fans pick out the comic books. You really kind of not, the movie wasn't over after you watched it. And then you wanted to start dissect it and why did this happen and how did they make this shot and these kind of things and what does this movie mean? Because the argument against this movie is that it doesn't really have a point. It doesn't really have a thematic to it, right? It's just basically, like you said, it's 5 different stories does it tie together in the end? What do you think?
Well, and it's funny because this is one of my biggest critiques when I watched it blind, had no idea about the film at all. I had just heard Pulp Fiction, and they were like, okay, well, we got to sit down and show you Pulp Fiction. And I was like, I'm so frustrated. And they're like, this is a piece that's not about the destination, it's the journey. It doesn't matter what's in the suitcase. And I was like, but that's the whole reason we're doing this. I got on the roller coaster to get to the suitcase. No. You think you got on the roller coaster to get to the suitcase, but you didn't. You got on the roller coaster and then you enjoyed the ride. And I was like, oh, I see. In a world where so many films are based on this plot-driven detective crime style, find the answer, next beat, next story beat, and culminating in the massive conclusion, you don't have a traditionally structured narrative with a save the cat plot line. You have something equally successful but completely different.
So the argument, I remember I was in after I saw this movie, and I saw it a couple times. I saw it a few times. It was one of those rare movies I actually saw a few times at the cinema. And there's cashier. I grew up in a grocery store. Was saying I love Pulp Fiction, but the movie isn't about anything at all. He goes, it was okay, but my boyfriend loved it and so much. And that's another argument too. There's some sexist elements, and it's probably more of a boys' movie than a girls' movie, without using those labels. But I kind of figured, even though I didn't know what this word was, and I said it in different kind of vernacular, but it's the argument is that the film is about American nihilism. So basically, it's a rejection of all moral principles. It's like kind of like an anti-religious, anti-spiritual movie, so that life is kind of meaningless, right?
Mm-hmm. I was gonna say it's kind of got this nihilistic hedonism to it, and like this almost sort of debauchery. Like there's no moral compass, and you could argue that almost every character is a bad person.
Every character is, right?
Yeah.
And is a bad person.
Yeah, and that's another thing. And in fact, I would say that's one of the biggest like markers, is that everyone is amoral, everyone's a little bit messed up, it's arguably that they're all bad people, which is kind of not normal for the time. There's always a hero, there's always a good guy, there's always a bad guy, even if
especially
the hero,
then, right? Like, but we were entering the anti-hero world, right? Well, like so that's what we were entering. So like it's like Sopranos 5 years later, there's not one redeemable character on that show. You can argue that Dr. Melfi is the only one, but you can kind of like, she did some sketchy things as well. But every character on that show is a liar. Every character basically does bad things. Most of them are murderers. All of them are hypocrites. But we liked watching these characters. We liked watching Pulp Fiction. Like, they're murderers, right? They're bad people, but we like them. We like the bad people. And this is the birth of the 90s. Like, this is my era. This is the era that I grew up in, right? Like, you had like Nirvana, and you had like Pearl Jam, and you had like all these like independent singer-songwriters who were becoming mainstream because they were talking about deep, dark things. And like, I wasn't happy, even though I had every advantage in the world. Like, I was white, I was upper middle class, you know what I mean? I was relatively handsome, you know what I mean? But for some reason, why wasn't I happy? And it's sort of like that. So this movie kind of like, doesn't really matter, who cares? And we kind of ate this up. I'm going to use your phrase. We ate it up like cotton candy because we wanted to see a movie like this. It made us like want to like, oh yeah, it doesn't really matter, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, that's sort of what happened. And of course, like, you know, like I talk about The Sopranos, but like even like even wrestling, like back in the day, where you would have like in the 80s, like Hulk Hogan was the American hero, and he took his vitamins. And then now in this era, all of a sudden you had Stone Cold Steve Austin, who like gave the finger to his boss and like beat up his boss, and like he was the bad guy, but he was the good guy to us.
You have some awesome points here about it being in the zeitgeist. Like, the zeitgeist of, you know, it's the 90s and we're realizing that happiness and unhappiness strikes indeterminately. It doesn't matter if you're rich, white, upper class, or not at all, and anything in between. Like, we're allowed to feel ennui, and we're allowed to feel aimless, and we're allowed to feel confused about our life regardless. It really is the counterculture of, like, the military crisp style. You put all the advantages, go be successful, and what is success? And you boil it down to these anti-heroes that you want to watch just because you want to watch them. You don't need them to be justified. It's just a good story, and we want to see the ride.
Yeah, that's why this movie kind of changed cinema. That's like the whole bullet point finale to what I'm trying to say.
Well, and you also make a really interesting point about the birth of the anti-hero. There are anti-heroes in, like, all throughout, you know, genres throughout history, but usually an anti-hero, like, let's say we're doing like crime detective stuff, and you have, you know, the amoral, ambiguous character and a couple of the anti-heroes. There's usually only a handful of them per novel, per movie. Usually there's always a good guy, an innocent kid, a victim. But in Pulp Fiction, no, everyone is morally ambiguous. Everyone's seedy. Everyone's doing something that's wrong. And where is the good guy? You don't know. Figure it out.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the story with Butch and Marcellus, what they kind of like, these are bad people, right? And they get in this fight, and then, but at the same time, they go into this underground store, and they're trying. I guess the point of that situation, that storyline, is that there's actually worse people than the worst people, kind of a thing, right?
Yeah, and isn't there also, and this is where I'm gonna, because it's been a few years, I feel like I'm gonna get the subplot wrong. There's is it Uma Thurman who has the drug overdose? They jam like the adrenaline in her, and then but like they don't really do any sort of aftercare. They're just kind of like, okay, and we gotta go to the next thing now. Like, everyone just does the bare minimum to be not horrifically evil. You know what I mean?
It's a crime movie without there's not a trace of a cop in the movie. There's not a hint or a trace of a cop in the entire movie.
And it's got this surrealist reality to it. And you know what I mean? Like, there are parts of it that are so gritty, like staying with the violence, showing the violence, and then staying there like longer than you'd expect. There's like, that actually is a very real take on when a violent act occurs. Like, it's not like you're going to get shot in real life and then miraculously cut to being in the hospital. No, like, you're going to be there with your wound until you get the ambulance, right? So they do a couple like realistic things, but all within this bubble of unreality and fantastical, like a fantastical world.
Yeah.
Which is also kind of an interesting thing at the time. Like, you almost get hyper real moments within the non-reality.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's one of those movies that it was. The funny thing about it is that I saw this movie like maybe like 10 times between 1994 and 1996, and I haven't seen it since. Like I tried to watch it maybe like 5-6 years ago, and I lost like 2 minutes because for me this movie it's like it's too much in my past in a lot of ways. Like it defines me too much. So it's sort of like I don't really want to. It reminds me, like all the scenes remind me of something that happened back then when that movie came out, or back when I was watching this movie multiple times, and it's almost like I don't really want to like go back there. It's just, I don't know if you have a movie example of that, but it's like, you're so young, you probably don't. Yeah, but it's like I don't like I just can't go there anymore. It reminds me too much of a time where I should have been happier, and it's just like, it's classic cliche where I should have been happier and I should have like taken in what was occurring in my life instead of like being so self-pity kind of thing. So, but
that's the thing, right? Like, and that kind of ties back to the movie too, because had you been like, air quotes, like the perfect person you wanted to be in that time, would that movie have had that resonance to you? Like, would it be as meaningful now 20 years later when you think about it and think about what it means? Like, it's a lot about what it means to be human. Like, an amazing thing about this film is it was incredibly culturally meaningful for that time. It encapsulates perfectly on a pedestal this moment in time for a generation of people watching it, never seeing anything like it before. And when they watch it now, they go, wow, that is perfect nostalgia for me, good, bad, or indifferent, of the feelings it implies. Like, for me, this happens with songs. There'll be a song that comes out over the summer, and whether I had a great summer or a terrible summer, if that song gets played on like the way back playback on the radio, and I'm like, and I'm right back to being 14 and remembering all the terrible, wonderful things that were happening to me when I was 14. Like, oh, that boy in camp didn't like me, and oh, my parents moved, and it was the harrowing summer of being a preteen or a teenager. But then I look back and go, oh man, I had it great. Like, what was I so worried about? But that's kind of the beauty of reliving something from your past, seeing it with the eyes of someone older.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's exactly it. So a couple last fun points I want to make about this film. The word fuck is used 265 times.
That's amazing. That in itself is probably a new thing for the 90s. Just that much. And
the funny story about this is that I have a friend of mine who loved this movie. Like, we all love this movie. And his dad was a accountant, like really smart man, like one of the smartest mans I ever met. Like just had a really good brain. And he took his dad to see this movie because he really wanted to get his dad's take. And the opening scene comes up with like Honey Bun and the guy at the coffee shop. And after the opening credits start, he whispers in his son's ears and goes, they use the F word 34 times, son. 34 times in 4 minutes they use the F word. Because I don't know if I can handle this. And because he's an accountant, he's like adding the numbers up in his head, right?
That's amazing.
So and then go ahead.
No, my grandmother once took out a VHS of the Shawshank Redemption and cut it up with scissors in front of me because there were too many swear words.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing too that changed things. So last point, the movie only won best one Oscar. That's it, for best original screenplay by Quentin Tarantino, and he shared it with Roger Avery. It was also nominated for Best Picture, nominated for Best Actor, John Travolta, Best Supporting Actor, Samuel L. Jackson, who kind of got one of the big shafts of all time. Samuel L. Jackson not winning Best Supporting Actor for this role. But then again, the guy went off to make, like, he was unknown then. But then you know him, right? Like, so he's like in every single movie in Hollywood movie today. So Best Supporting Actress, Uma Thurman. Best Editing, Sally Menke. Do you know what picture won Best Picture that year?
No, what won Best Picture? Wait, Lion King?
Forrest Gump.
Oh, of course. Yeah, wait, hold on. Wasn't Lion King also 94?
No, it was also 94 was a great year for movies. Yeah, Lion King was also 94.
But you know what? I mean, Forrest Gump, I get it.
Yeah.
That being said, like, even the fact that an indie darling like Pulp Fiction won in Best Original Screenplay, and the fact that the screenplay is so non-narrative and won, says really a lot, especially when it goes up against all the films that came out in 94.
Yeah, but the real point is that nobody remembers what wins Best Picture. People remember the films that kind of made a statement, right? So, like, Forrest Gump won, but the movie that's going to be remembered is from this era is Pulp Fiction. And one last fun fact about this movie is that 2 movies premiered on the October weekend that basically went off to great success. Pulp Fiction premiered and Shawshank Redemption premiered. Those 2 movies premiered on the same weekend. And those 2 movies, and like IMDb is like the popularity contest, those 2 movies are in the top 10 of most popular movies of all time. In the top 10 on IMDb so far. And they premiered on the same weekend in 1994. Isn't that funny?
That's fantastically interesting. But like what also gets it to me is that if you saw both of those movies in that weekend, what a weird weekend you had.
Yeah. Who would have thought, right? Those 2 movies would have been such iconic movies that they are today.
Yeah, and like one's a true story. Like the Shawshank Redemption, I believe, is based on a true story, and the other one is just a wild ride in fantastic. And both are phenomenal films. You can say that, you know, comparatively speaking, the Shawshank Redemption is a very traditional film by the standards of, say, the Academy, but Pulp Fiction altered the minds of a generation moving forward, and its echo still echoes today.
Yeah, and it's probably the most watched movie on television too, right? So I think that movie's on television the most out of any other movie.
And it's funny because I remember being, you know, in like grade school, and my dad's like, "Oh, Pulp Fiction's on." I'm like, "Kierston, go to bed." I'm like, why? So yeah, you got anything else on Pulp Fiction?
I do. I apologize for taking over the podcast a little bit. Obviously,
no, that's exactly. We should tell the listeners that we divided the research for this. So every like one of the films you'll hear one of us is talking more. It's because we divided the research.
But this movie's a little bit personal as well, right? Like it defines my teens. Like that's in a nutshell. So.
Oh, wait until we do Freaks, because that's a real personal one for me too. I'll get into it when we talk about Freaks. Okay. All right, this has been awesome. I'm so happy. All right, if you want to reach out to us, you can find us on Twitter at me at Kierstonator, KIERSTONATOR, and Matt at Matthew Toffolo, TOFFOLO, or you can find the podcast on Twitter at Wild Sound Pod. You can also find us on Facebook at Wild Sound Podcast, and you can email the podcast and the show hosts, both of us, at podcast@wildsoundpodcast.com. Am I missing anything, Matt?
Nothing at all.
Awesome. All right. Well, that is Pulp Fiction. I'm looking forward to hearing more about some awesome films that changed history. So, what's next?